Station 11 by Emily St. John Mandel. Part 4, The Starship, Chapter 23. A little note here just to take you behind the curtain a little. I have had a virus or a throat infection ever since I started recording this. It's been about 3 weeks now. The entire time I've been sick in one way or another. It's almost as if I have the survivable version of the Georgia flu. So it's a weird strain of the Georgia flu, one that you don't die. So I felt like dying a few times, but I have not yet died. All right, now on to chapter 23. I just don't understand, the tuba said mid-morning, after several hours of searching for Saeed and Dieter. No one understood, no one responded. The disappearances were incomprehensible. They could find no trace. The symphony searched in teams of 4, grimly, methodically, but the forest was dense and choked with underbrush. They could have passed within feet of Dieter and Saeed and not known it. In those first hours, there were moments when Kirsten caught herself thinking that there must have simply been some misunderstanding, that Dieter and Saeed must have somehow walked by them in the dark, somehow gone the wrong way down the road, that they'd reappear with apologies at any moment. But scouts had gone back and forth on the road for miles. Again and again, Kirsten stopped still in the forest, listening. Was someone watching her? Just now, had someone stepped on a branch? But the only sounds were of other search teams, and everyone felt watched. They met in the forest and on the road at intervals, looked at one another, and said nothing. The slow passage of the sun across the sky, the air over the road unsteady with heat waves. When night began to fall, they gathered by the lead caravan, which had once been an extended bed Ford pickup truck. Because survival is insufficient, words painted on the canopy in answer to the question that had dogged the symphony since they'd set out on the road. The words were very white in the rising evening. Kirsten stood by Dieter's favorite horse, Bernstein, and pressed her hand flat against his side. He stared at her with an enormous dark eye. "We've traveled so far together," the conductor said. "There are certain qualities of light that blur the years. Sometimes when Kirsten and August were on watch together at dawn, she would glance at him as the sun rose, and for a fleeting instant she could see what he'd look like as a boy. Here on this road, the conductor looked much older than she had an hour earlier. She ran a hand through her short gray hair. "There have been 4 times," she said, "in all these years, when symphony members have become separated from the symphony, and in every single instance they've followed the separation protocol, and we've been reunited at the destination." "Alexandra?" "Yes." "Will you state the separation protocol, please?" It had been drilled into all of them. "We never travel without a destination," Alexander said. If you're ever separated from the symphony on the road, you make your way to the destination and wait." "And what is the current destination?" "The Museum of Civilization in the Severn City Airport." "Yes." The conductor was quiet, looking at them. The forest in shadow now, and there was still some light in the corridor of sky above the road, the last pink of sunset streaking the clouds. "I've been on the road for 15 years, she said, "and Saeed's been with me for 12. Dieter for even longer." "He was with me in the beginning," Gil said. "We walked out of Chicago together." "I leave neither of them willingly." The conductor's eyes were shining. "But I won't risk the rest of you by staying here a day longer." That night they kept a double watch, teams of 4 instead of 2, and set out before dawn the following morning. The air was damp between the walls of the forest, and the clouds marbled overhead, a scent of pine in the air. Kirsten walked by the first caravan, trying to think of nothing, a sense of being caught in a terrible dream. They stopped at the end of the afternoon. The feverish summers of this century, this impossible heat. The lake glittered through the trees. This had been one of those places that wasn't quite suburbia, but wasn't quite not, an in-between district, where the houses stood on wooded lots. They were within 3 days of the airport now. Kirsten sat on a log with her head in her hands, thinking, "Where are you? Where are you? Where are you?" And no one bothered her until August came to sit nearby. "I'm sorry," he said. "I think they were taken," she said, without raising her head, "and I can't stop thinking about that what the prophet was saying in St. Deborah, that thing about the light. I don't think I heard it. I was packing up. They call themselves the light. What about it? If you are the light, she said, then your enemies are darkness, right? I suppose. If you are the light, if your enemies are darkness, then there's nothing that you can't justify. There's nothing that you can't survive, because there's nothing that you will not do. He sighed. We can only remain hopeful, he said. We have to assume that the situation will become more clear. But 4 teams set out in search of dinner, and only 3.5 returned. I turned, and she was gone, Jackson said of Sidney, the clarinet. He returned to the camp alone and shaken. They'd found a stream, Jackson said, about a quarter-mile down the road in the direction from which they'd come. He'd knelt on the bank to fill the water container, and when he looked up, she had vanished. Had she fallen in? No, he said. He would have heard a splash, and he was downstream, so she would have passed him. It was a small stream, and the banks weren't steep. There was just the woods all around him, a sense of being watched. He called her name, but she was nowhere. He noticed then that the bird-song had stopped. The woods had gone still. No one spoke for a moment when he'd finished telling the story. The symphony gathered close around him. Where's Olivia? Lynn asked suddenly. Olivia was in the back of the first caravan playing with a rag doll. I want you in my sight, Lynn whispered. Not just within sight, within reach. Do you understand? She was close with Dieter, the first oboe said. This was true, and they were all silent, thinking of the clarinet and searching their memories for clues. Had she seemed like herself lately? None of them was sure. What did it mean to seem like yourself in the course of such unspeakable days? How was anyone supposed to seem? Are we being hunted? Alexander asked. It seemed plausible. Kirsten looked over her shoulder into the shadows of the trees. A search party was organized, but the light was gone. Lighting a fire seemed too dangerous, so they ate dinner from the preserved food stores, rabbit jerky and dried apples, and settled in for an uneasy night. In the morning they delayed for 5 hours, searching, but they couldn't find her. They set off into another searing day. Is it logical that they could have all been taken? August was walking beside Kirsten. Dieter, Said, the clarinet? How could anyone overpower them so silently? There was a lump in her throat. It was difficult to speak. Maybe they just left. Abandon us? Yes. Why would they? I don't know. Later in the day, someone thought to search the clarinet's belongings and found the note. The beginning of a letter. Dear friends, I find myself immeasurably weary, and I have gone to rest in the forest. It ended there. The date suggested that either it had been written 11 months earlier, or that the clarinet didn't know what year or month it was, one or the other. Neither scenario was unlikely. This was an era when exact dates were seldom relevant, and keeping track required a degree of dedication. The note had been folded and refolded several times, soft along the creases. It seems more theoretical than anything, the first cello said. Like she wrote it a year ago and then changed her mind. It doesn't prove anything. That's assuming she wrote it a year ago, said Lynn. She could have written it last week. I think it shows suicidal intent. Where were we a year ago? Does anyone remember? Mackinac City, August said. New Petoskey, East Jordan. All those little places down the coast on the way to New Sarnia. I don't remember her seeming different a year ago, Lynn said. Was she sad? No one was sure. They all felt they should have been paying more attention. Still, the scouts reported no one behind or ahead of them on the road. Impossible not to imagine that they were being watched from the forest. What was the symphony without Dieter and the clarinet and Said? Kirsten had thought of Dieter as sort of an older brother, she realized, perhaps a cousin, a fixture in her life and in the life of the symphony. It seemed in some abstract way impossible that the symphony continued without him. She had never been close with the clarinet, but the clarinet was conspicuous in her absence. She only spoke with Said to argue with him now, but the thought of him having come to harm was sheer agony. Her breath was shallow in her chest, and the tears were silent and constant. Late in the day, she found a folded piece of paper in her pocket. She recognized August's handwriting. A fragment from my friend. If your soul left this earth, I would follow and find you. Silent, my starship suspended in night. She'd never seen his poetry before and was impossibly moved by it. Thank you, she said when she saw him next. He nodded. The land became wilder, the houses subsiding. They had to stop 3 times to clear fallen trees. They used 2-handed saws, working as quickly as possible, with sweat soaking through their clothes. Scouts posted here and there, watching the road and the forest, jumping and aiming their weapons at small sounds. Kirsten and August walked out ahead over the conductor's objections. A half-mile beyond the stalled caravans, they came upon a rolling plain. A golf course, August said. You know what that means. They'd found 2 full bottles of scotch and a can of miraculously still edible cocktail olives in a golf course clubhouse once, and August had been trying to replicate the experience ever since. The clubhouse was at the end of a long driveway, obscured behind a bank of trees. It was burnt out, the roof draped like fabric from the 3 remaining walls. Golf carts were toppled over on their sides in the grass. The sky was darkening now, and it was hard to see much of the clubhouse interior in the pre-storm light, just glints of shattered glass from where the windows had been. Too dangerous to go in with the roof half fallen. On the far side they found a small man-made lake with a rotted pier, a flicker of movement under the surface. They walked back to the caravans for the fishing equipment. The 1st and 3rd cellos were sawing the last fallen tree. Back at the golf course pond, there were so many fish that it was possible to catch them with the net alone, scooping them up from the overcrowded water. The fish were small, brownish things, unpleasant to the touch. Thunder in the distance, and then a short time later the first drops of rain. August, who carried his instrument at all times, wrapped his violin case in a plastic sheet he kept in his bag. They worked through the downpour, Kirsten dragging the net through the water, August gutting and cleaning. He knew she couldn't stand to gut fish, something she'd seen on the road that first year out of Toronto, a fleeting impression of some vision that she couldn't exactly remember but still made her ill when she tried to consider it, and he'd always been kind about it. She could hardly see him through the rain. For a moment it was possible to forget that 3 people were missing. When the storm at last subsided, they filled the net with fish and carried it back along the driveway. Steam was rising from the road. They found the place where the fallen trees had been cut and pulled off the road, but the symphony had departed. They must have passed by on the road while we were fishing, August said. It was the only reasonable conclusion. They confirmed the route with the conductor before they'd returned to the golf course with the fishing net. The pond had been far enough off the road that they wouldn't have seen the symphony, hidden as they were behind the clubhouse, and the sound of the symphony's passing would have been lost in the storm. They moved fast, Kirsten said, but her stomach was clenched, and August was jingling the handful of change in his pocket. It didn't entirely add up. Why would the symphony travel in a downpour unless there was some unexpected emergency? The storm had washed the road clear of tracks, leaves and twigs and swirled patterns over the pavement, and the heat was rising again. The sky had a broken apart look at it about it now, patches of blue between the clouds. The fish will go bad fast in this heat, August said. This was a quandary. Every cell in Kirsten's body ached to follow the symphony, but it was safer to light a fire in daylight, and they'd eaten nothing but a strip or 2 each of rabbit jerky that morning. They gathered wood for a fire, but of course everything was wet, and it took a long time to spark even the slightest flame. The fire smoked badly, their eyes stinging while they cooked, but at least the smoke replaced the stench of fish from their clothes. They ate as much fish as they could, and carried the rest with them in the net, set off half sick down the road past the golf course, past a number of houses that had obviously been ransacked years earlier, ruined furniture strewn about on the lawns. After a while, they jettisoned the fish. It was turning in the heat, and sped up, walking as quickly as possible, but the symphony was still out of sight, and surely by now there would have been some sign of them, hoofprints or footprints or wheel marks on the road. They didn't speak. Near twilight, the road crossed under a highway. Kirsten climbed up to the overpass for a vantage point, hoping that the symphony might perhaps be just ahead, but the road curved towards the distant shine of the lake and disappeared behind the trees. The highway was miles of permanent gridlock, small trees growing now between cars and thousands of windshields reflecting the sky. There was a skeleton in the driver's seat of the nearest car. They slept under a tree near the overpass, side by side, on top of August's plastic sheet. Kirsten slept fitfully, aware each time she woke of the emptiness of the landscape, the lack of people and animals and caravans around her. Hell is the absence of people you long for.